Well, hello again. The last time I did a video, we ended in May of 2004 when we talked about the foreign NGO law. Hopefully you remember that. Another event that took place in May of 2004 was that the Chechen President Ahmed Kadyrov, who had been the former chief mufti and had declared a jihad, but who was then now, when he was elected president in '03, began to work with the Putin administration to try to control the violence and reassert a sense of order in the country. He was killed by a bomb. He was attending a Soviet Victory Day. That's the day in May when they celebrate the end of the Great Patriotic War. Soviet Victory Day, that's what it's now called. And he was killed by the more extreme fundamentalist groups that wanted the war to continue and didn't want anything to do with working with the Russian government. Okay. Then in June, well, here comes some real problems for Putin. In June, he proposes a new welfare law. Now, I have to go back again a bit for the history of the Soviet-era welfare system. Everyone had a job in the Soviet Union. It was guaranteed by the Constitution, so everyone had positions. And often your child care was provided by your employer. So men and women brought their kids to the workplace, and there would be a child care center there. Health care was provided free by the state. Education was free. Public transportation for seniors was free. There were a lot of things that made life easier for many of the Russians. Not so much the women, because as I said before, the women have had a hard time. They would go to work and then come home. Before they could come home, they'd have to stop at the market, wait in lines to buy food, to come home and prepare the food, and then take care of the children at home. Extreme sexism in most Russian families in the Soviet era. But there were a lot of perks that were especially appealing and beneficial to older citizens. But I've mentioned before that Putin and the Western advisors that came in with Yeltsin wanted to establish a more pay-as-you-go, a more neoliberal policy. And this is a part of that, because the people that are around, the economic advisors around Putin, are very much like those same advisors who were advising the first president, Yeltsin. So they want to eliminate a lot of these free perks and give the people who, at the low end of the spectrum of income, they want to give them cash payments. So replace in-kind services by cash. And the argument always against this is that the payments in cash are not going to keep up with inflation, and so that the poorer people will, instead of getting a leg up, will always remain at the bottom of any income spectrum. So this generated a lot of controversy. There were some demonstrations. This is the first time that there were major public protests against policies of the Putin administration. This is June of 2004. In July of 2004, again, if you're hopefully following along with the overheads that I've sent you, in July of 2004, we have the trial of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the head of the Yukos oil company. He's being charged with fraud, and he will be found guilty on May 31st of '05, that's the next year we'll look at, found guilty and sentenced to 9 years in prison. That same month, well, let me reiterate the reasons behind the arrest of Khodorkovsky: his political ambitions, his failure to abide by that social contract that Putin put in place with the oligarchs when he came into power, his funding of the quote opposition parties, and his desire to have a different type of pipeline than the Russian government was sponsoring with China. All right, so that same month, July of 2004, Putin meets with the oligarchs because the arrest of Khodorkovsky was troubling to world markets and Western investors. And the trial, when it begins, is even more double and more concerning. And so there's a lot of fear. What do you think the fear is among the oligarchs? The fear is that those assets that they have amassed through the privatization effort during the Yeltsin years are vulnerable to a new, more powerful president who may want to put them in their place. So while they have this meeting, and the graphics of this meeting are interesting because when they come in to a meeting, they are all there before Putin walks in. There is a long table that has 18 name tags on one side and one chair on the other side. And of course, they all go up and find their place, name tag, and sit down or stand and talk. But when the door opens and Putin walks in, he takes the one chair on the opposite end of this long table where now he's going to tell the oligarchs what they can and cannot do. Now, Putin reassures the oligarchs that he has no plans for a national reorganization or renationalization of private industry. He's not attempting to establish a command economy in the Soviet form. But he tells them in no uncertain terms that they must stay out of politics. That means they must stay out of anti-Kremlin politics. They can't oppose his views. And he says that they must be socially responsible, which is Putin speak for, you've got to pay your taxes. So he is reassuring to the oligarchs that he's not going after them as a class. He has picked on Khodorkovsky because he believes Khodorkovsky has violated that contract, social contract, and has gone too far. And he is going to be the poster child for not crossing Putin. All right, in September, we have a real tragedy in Russia. September 1st every year is the start of the Russian school year. And on September 1st, 2004, Chechen guerrillas attack a public school. Well, they're all public schools. A public school, a grade school and middle school in a town called Beslan, Beslan. And there is a 3-day siege of this school. They have as hostages almost 800 small children and their teachers and a few parents who were swept up in their attack. This is all planned by the leading fundamentalist terrorist in Chechnya, a man named Shamil, Shamil Basayev, last name, Basayev, Basayev. And they make demands on the Russian government. Of course, what is the demand? End the war in Chechnya, declare Chechen independence, and withdraw all Russian forces and aid to the what they call the puppet government that has been set up by the Russians in Chechnya. On the third day, the Russian military attacks, and they attack the school buildings that are held by the terrorists. They attack with tanks, rocket grenades, heavy machine guns. And as you can imagine, there is a slaughter that ensues. 334 of these hostages are killed, including 186 children. Hundreds more are injured. 31 of the 32 hostage takers are killed. The one that survives, wounded, is put on trial in 2005. Um, but this is a major blow to the security of Russia and to the Putin administration, because he has staked his reputation on establishing order in Chechnya and bringing a new sense of security and strength to the Russian state. And this attack on the school is a major blow to Putin's plans. All right, so we move on to 2005. In January of 2005, the nation is again shocked by widespread protest in many cities across the country over these proposed welfare reforms that Putin has talked about. There are demands in the Duma for a no-confidence vote on the Putin administration, but of course United Russia is able to squelch that. Most United Russian members abstain from the vote, but the vote fails because there's not enough opposition. But many members of United Russia express their desire to distance themselves from these type of reforms, which means distancing themselves from Putin. So, March of 2005, the Putin administration comes up with another one of these created organizations, a public chamber, or it's sometimes called the civic chamber. This is an organization that is part of a series of reforms that Putin is going to put into place as a result of the Beslan crisis. The argument for the civic or public forum is that this is going to provide a broad platform for organizations to participate in direct dialogue with the Russian government. This is directed again at civic organizations within Russia. There are 126 members of the Civic or Public Forum. They're selected in three ways. The first 42 members are nominated by the Russian president. They, in turn, those 42, in turn, pick 42 members from national public organizations, non-governmental organizations that exist in the country. And then those 84 select the remaining 42. And again, this is part of Putin's continuing efforts to get control over the what we call civic society, civil society. Now let me talk a little bit more about some of these other reforms that Putin pushes at the time. He claims that all of these reforms are going to make Russia stronger, more secure, but we'll come back to that in a minute after I describe them. You'll see I don't think that's the real target. The first set of reforms deal with the Federation Council. And this is the upper body of the Federal Assembly that represents the regions of the country. The governors and the heads of the legislatures have been usually the two people from each region serving in the Federation Council. Putin initiates a plan to eliminate the direct election of the governors because he believes that those governors have been building their own little power bases, their own little fiefdoms in these regions, and he believes in the power vertical, as it's later called. The process for the future will be that the new governors are going to be nominated by the president. So they're going to be people that are going to be loyal to the president. They're nominated by the president, and then the regional parliament will confirm them. All right. It also has a reform for the lower house, the Duma. Now, if you remember when we talked about the type of elections in the Duma, that there were two ways people could get elected to the Duma. You could run in a district or in a constituency, and that would be one person per constituency, winner take all. But there were also a national list. Each party published a list of its members who, if the party could break the threshold of national vote, if they got, and the threshold was 5%, they got 5% of the national vote, then depending upon their percentage of the national vote, they would get so many members in the Duma, and the party would pick which members of the Duma from that party list would be in the Duma. Now, if you remember back in '93, there were a number of parties that couldn't make the threshold, but they still had some slight representation. A few candidates here and there would get elected because these are people who are well known in the region, and use their notoriety or their political connections, to get votes. But the party itself that they were representing didn't have enough votes to get seats in the off the national list. So this is a continuation of the earlier reforms against political parties because Putin wants order in the system. He wants it regularized. He wants the number of parties down. And so the new parliamentary election candidates must come from the party list. So you're not going to have all these little independents, not many, but you're not going to have these independents elected. So it's going to try to put more emphasis on the role of parties. But in Putin's mind, it's the parties, again, refer you back to the Sackler, that are going to be able to cooperate. Even the opposition parties will be able to cooperate in the Duma with the president's party, United Russia. And also regarding the Duma, so he's eliminating the individual constituencies, just having party lists, and he's raising the threshold to try to get rid of all these smaller parties that campaign but don't have any success. Raise the threshold up to 7%. And if you remember when I talked about '93, I said this is the last parliament in which there is a really organized liberal democratic opposition to Putin. And Yabloko and the Union of Right Forces never been able to break the 7%, as they appeal to a very small elite, the Russian intelligentsia, the intellectuals, academics, professional class, and they haven't been able to break that. There's also part of these reforms caused by the Beslan crisis that are directed at cracking down on extremist talk, any extremist organization. Putin promises tougher border controls. He promises to crack down on police corruption. He creates a single anti-terrorist organization that is supposed to be able to deal with them. And he appoints a close friend of his, Dmitry Kozak, Kozak, as president of this new Southern Federal District, which is the Caucasus. So it is Kozak becomes the 8th of these presidential representatives to the regions, again to give Putin more direct input and have his personal representative there. All the while this is being addressed, Putin keeps talking about the need for national unity and an executive chain of command. That's the power vertical, again, that seems to be how he wants to govern the country. All right. In April Fool's Day, April 1st, 2005, Putin makes a speech, which I think is quite funny because the theme of it is democracy is our first priority. All right. And then in May, there's a very interesting interview with Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes. Now, you know 60 Minutes, I assume. Mike Wallace is now dead, but he was probably one of the toughest interviewers on any television network. And he sits down with an extended interview with Putin. And it's quite fascinating what Putin has to say. Because Wallace asked him, these quote reforms that you seem to be bringing, many Westerners question that this is an attack upon democracy. And Putin's response says that, he says, you accuse me of doing away with democracy, but the world's largest democracy, India, appoints its governors. So why do you attack me when I suggest that we need to appoint the governors rather than have them elected? And he said, now look at your own country. You have an electoral college. The people do not elect the president in the United States. You have indirect election. You elect electors of the electoral college, and they are the ones who elect the president. He said, in Russia, we have direct election for a president. The people vote directly for the candidate for president. He also attacks the United States because he says in the 2000 election, it was not the people that decided the election. This is the Supreme Court that decided. So here you have a court, 9 people who are not elected and serve for life, telling the American people who their next president is going to be. He said in Russia, the opposition can always express their opinion anywhere and at any time. And he said, and you talk about America having a free press. Well, then he goes into this attack about Dan Rather, who had been critical of George Bush and had, on the CBS Evening News, had reported that Bush, during the Vietnam War, had served very little time in the Texas National Guard and spent most of his time running around the country campaigning for Republican candidates. And he didn't really vet this information. He couldn't corroborate it, but it went out on national TV, and CBS said this violates our fairness policy and our rules, and they fired Dan Rather from the evening news. So Putin twists this around and says, you see, even your press is controlled by wealthy people, and the bosses, people that own CBS, run CBS, can decide what news is put on, and they fired Dan Rather. Putin then goes on to talk about Russia, and he said, we have a country in which oligarchs have taken advantage of a weak state, meaning under the President Yeltsin, and have taken control of many industries, and there is too much corruption in my country. He said, but you have corruption in the United States too. No country is free of corruption, and we, meaning he, our administration is fighting this corruption. So he ends the interesting dialogue with Mike Wallace with a statement in English. All the best to every American family. Okay. So that's a pretty interesting defense from Putin's perspective of what he's trying to do in democracy in Russia and its relation to democracy. Now, it's not a democracy that we in the West are comfortable with. I certainly do not want to live under that type of democracy. But he gives a pretty good justification for his position. Now, right, read down the page, go to July of 2005, in which the former Prime Minister, Mikhail Kasyanov, is charged with bribery and abuse of trust. And it's thought that Putin goes after him because it appears that Kasyanov was trying to rally opposition to Putin and become a potential presidential candidate in 2008. This presidential election that's coming up in 2008 presents a problem for Putin because the 1993 Constitution says that the president can serve for 2 consecutive terms. And
according to the letter of the Constitution, Putin would not be eligible to run in 2008. All right, let me move on. We're still on 2005. In July of 2005, there was a Russian think tank that reported that corruption had increased 10 times in Russia since 2001. And that's, I've talked about this corruption that is a daily occurrence for Russian citizens and a constant problem. In August of 2005, August, a terrible month, a Russian mini submarine with 7 members on board sinks in the Pacific. Now, this time, an American high-powered, sophisticated deep dive vehicle is used to rescue these 7 after 76 hours. And as a result of this, in September, Putin sacks the head of the Russian Navy, brings in someone else. September of 2005, Putin announces 4 national projects. And this, I think, will become a characteristic of the Putin regime, that he will announce these big, major projects. And it reminds me of the projects that were always part of the 5-year plans, because these were big projects that were going to take a number of years if they were going to be accomplished. And most of these projects have never been fully implemented. So one of the reasons he's doing this is he wants to revise the social welfare policy. And he says we're going to have Russia now focusing upon public health, improving the public health situation, improving education, improving housing, and the perennial problem of Russia, improving its agriculture. These are the 4 major national projects that he wants Russia in the next 5 to 6 years to be able to deal with. And you remember, these are instantly the health, the education, housing. These are all part of the public protests that have been leveled against the administration. To carry this out, he creates a council for the priority of national interest, and he appoints Dmitry Medvedev, his chief of staff, and soon to be deputy prime minister of his government. In October, the top central bank and tax service officials are charged with receiving bribes and fired. Again, this is the extent of corruption that is rafted through the system, and Putin selectively going after high-level officials to show that he is trying to deal with this corruption. The year ends in politics with a shake-up in the government in November of 2005. Putin brings Dmitry Medvedev, the head of this national project, in as his first deputy prime minister. Formerly, he was the chief of staff to the president's administration. He's an old friend. They worked together back in the Sobchak years in St. Petersburg. He's giving him a higher profile. And then he brings in Sergei Ivanov as a deputy prime minister. Ivanov is the defense minister now, as well as deputy prime minister. Most people think of him as a little more of a moderate among the Silovoki, remember the power forces, more pragmatic. He's known Putin since the 1970s. They were both in the KGB together. And so what many reporters talked about is that perhaps this shakeup in November, by bringing these 2 close people to Putin, high-level positions, is that he is trying both of them out, possibly, to maybe be his candidate for president if he can't figure out a way to run in 2008. All right, I'm going to end this here. It's 29 minutes, and the next one will begin with January of 2006. All right, get this over here and stop.